There are over 25,000 unique cards in Magic the Gathering, and while there's nothing wrong with running only the most efficient cards in your commander deck, using an underplayed card instead can help your deck feel more unique and thematic. And who knows, it might even save you some cash or power up your deck in a unique and interesting way. Today, I want to share 5 underrated white removal spells. White is quite possibly the strongest color for removal, offering a wide variety of spells and creatures that can deal with pretty much any permanent type in the game. In fact, according to EDH Rec, the 3 most played white cards in Commander are all removal spells, with Swords to Plowshare showing up in nearly 1.6 million decks. Swords is actually the 3rd most popular card in the entire format, only seeing less play than Sol Ring and Arcane Signet, which are both colorless. The point is, white is really good at removal. Now, I don't think you should run out and remove Swords to Plowshares from all of your decks, but there are plenty of decks that could benefit from trading an efficient creature removal spell for something more flexible. So, I put together a list of 5 cards that each appear in about 20,000 decks or less, hidden gems that might make your deck a little more unique. Starting with Fragmentize. Fragmentize is a sorcery spell that costs a single white mana. It appears in just over 5,000 decks and can destroy any artifact or enchantment with 4 mana value or less. Obviously, I would prefer instant speed, but at just a single mana, Fragmentize is the perfect answer for removing problematic permanents that aren't quite kill on sight. Rhystic Study and Smothering Tithe, for example, aren't going to lose you the game if they stick around for just a turn or two, but the sooner you can stop the value, the better. Or perhaps someone's equipped some Lightning Greaves on an important creature. For just 1 white, you can get rid of those pesky shoes, leaving you with plenty of extra mana to remove the actual problem. Even just getting rid of someone's turn 1 Sol Ring, something I normally wouldn't use my removal on, feels pretty good with Fragmentize. And yes, I know Fragmentize can't answer a lot of game-winning threats like a Generous Gift, but that's okay. These spells fill different roles, and unless you're in green and can run Nature's Claim, I think Fragmentize is very much underrated. Moving on, let's talk about another sorcery spell, Divine Gambit. For 2 white mana, Divine Gambit is an interesting removal option that appears in just 2,400 decks according to EDH Rec. It reads, exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment an opponent controls. That player may put a permanent card from their hand onto the battlefield. Now, I know what you're thinking, and yes, letting your opponent put any permanent card from their hand into play is a major downside. I mean, what if you exile a big creature, but they have an even bigger one just waiting in their hand? And that is definitely a risk when using this card, and probably the reason it sees so little play. But the flexibility to answer so many permanent types for just 2 mana is pretty good. Could it be worth it? For me, the answer is yes. I've played this card probably close to a dozen times in Commander, and not once has it lost me the game. And that's because I'm very careful with how I use it. In fact, there are 3 main scenarios where I would consider casting Divine Gambit. Scenario 1. There is a problem on the table that's so bad for me that it doesn't matter what else they can get from their hand, it will hurt less. For example, let's say I'm playing an Aristocrats deck and my opponent gets out a Rest in Peace, shutting down all my death triggers. Do I really care if they're able to cheat out a Blightsteel Colossus from their hand? No. I very likely have enough chump blockers to survive at least a turn or 2, and now my primary win con is turned back online. That trade is absolutely worth it, even more so because my other 2 opponents who didn't care about that Rest in Peace now have to turn their attention to the Blightsteel player instead of me. Scenario 2. I have a good idea of what's in my opponent's hand, and it's not that good. In some cases, this is literal, as there are several cards in Magic that let me see exactly what my opponent has. Or, more likely, my opponent has no cards in hand at all, meaning this removal spell is completely free. Either way, any deck that can take advantage of these strategies should consider Divine Gambit. And even if you're not forcing discards or looking at your opponent's hands, you can still just pick your targets carefully. For example, try to use this on a Spellsinger player who is less likely to have some huge bomb in hand, as opposed to a Reanimation player. Just recently, I used Divine Gambit to remove an opponent's Urabrask that had been transformed into the Great Work. The saga was at Chapter 2, meaning if they untapped, it would go to Chapter 3 and they would have gained access to all instants and sorceries in all graveyards, likely winning them the game. And what'd they get off the Gambit? A runaway Steamkin. A fine card to be sure, but much less effective at ending games. Scenario 3. I have a forced combat / goad deck, where the entire game plan is to let my opponents kill each other with giant creatures. In a deck like that, Divine Gambit seems like a perfect fit. Next up is Soul Partition. Appearing in just over 20,000 decks, Soul Partition is the most popular card I'll talk about on this list. Soul Partition is a 2-mana instant spell that costs 1 generic and 1 white mana. It reads, exile target non-land permanent. For as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may play it. A spell cast by an opponent this way costs 2 more to cast. In a way, Soul Partition has more in common with a bounce spell than a strict removal spell, as the targeted permanent can be recast from exile. Of course, your opponents have to pay extra to recast it, while you can play it as normal, meaning it's temporary removal that doubles as protection, unless you target a token, in which case it's gone forever. Either way, I found this card to be very effective in my games. As protection, it's even better if you have other cast from exile payoffs. And as removal, I think it's particularly strong against decks that like to cheat on mana costs, like Reanimator for example. Moving on, one of my favorite pet cards is Abolish. Showing up in just over 4,000 decks, Abolish is a 3-mana instant spell that costs 1 generic and 2 white mana. That said, I'm not sure I've ever actually paid any mana to cast this card. It reads, you may discard a Plains card rather than pay the spell's mana cost. Destroy target artifact or enchantment. It should come as no surprise that free interaction is really good in Commander. The only question is, how reliably can your deck have Plains in hand to pitch? Obviously, any mono white deck should have no problems here. Even a 2-color deck with white can probably make it happen. Once you get into 3 or more colors, you may have a bit more trouble. But then again, even if you do have to pay 3 mana for this, that's not that overcosted for the effect. Abolish is especially good in decks that like to draw 5, 10, or even more cards in a single turn. These decks are typically running cards like Reliquary Tower and Thought Vessel, but if you haven't found one of your no max hand size enablers yet and have to discard down to 7, Abolish is a free way to dump 2 cards out of your hand while destroying an opponent's permanent. Alright, finally, let's talk about Cut Short. Cut Short is a 3-mana instant spell that appears in nearly 7,000 decks on EDH Rec. It costs 2 generic and 1 white mana, although it has Convoke, which means you can tap your creatures to pay for this spell instead. It reads, destroy target planeswalker that was activated this turn, or tapped creature. Now, 3 mana for this effect is actually terrible. That said, if you have 3 untapped creatures, this spell is effectively free. It's very similar to a card like Devouring Light, for example, although I think Cut Short is even better. Sure, Devouring Light does exile, but it can only hit attacking creatures, which I think is a more narrow restriction. Devouring Light is unlikely to work against powerful creatures like Captain Sisay or Arcanus the Omnipotent, for example. Of course, Cut Short is really bad against Vigilance. But either way, what really pushes Cut Short over the edge for me is its ability to hit Planeswalkers. While Planeswalkers aren't exactly common in Commander, letting a Planeswalker hit their ultimate ability is very often game over, and in some decks, having that flexibility to deal with a problematic Planeswalker is very valuable. Not to mention, plenty of decks want to tap down their creatures for other value. In these cases, having cards with Convoke is just enabling your strategy. At any rate, what do you think of these 5 cards? Are they worth trying in one of your decks? Did I leave out your favorite white removal spell? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to like and subscribe to help my channel grow.